Comes from Psalm 118, verse 24. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. And now we'll sing the song that comes directly from that verse. This is the day that the Lord has made, that the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it, and be glad in it. This is the day that the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it. This is the day that the Lord has made.
Well, good evening, and thank you for joining us for another edition of Peak of the Week. Particularly, we know we have more this week at home watching, and so we welcome you from home as well tonight. Last week, I believe it was on the 6th, an aunt of mine who lives in East Texas, outside of Athens, turned 100 years of age. She has seen a lot, my Aunt Maxine has. She's endured a lot, suffered a lot in those years. She still lives by herself at home out in the country, does her own thing around the house. My uncle died in 1997, so she's been a widow since the age of 77. That's hard for me to believe. She lost a son who was brutally murdered probably around 1981, I think it was. Lost another son who took his own life. That was probably about 10 years or more ago now. She's got 3 kids left. 2 of them live close enough in Texas that they can bring her supplies, the food that she needs. One of them does, and then the other one that lives closest takes her to all her appointments or anything she needs to, where she needs to go. She hadn't driven for several years. She is a tough lady, made a hearty stop. But my guess is, if her remaining kids really stop to think about it, for the last 15, 20 years, every extra day they've been able to have her in their lives is a gift. Every extra day is something special that you don't know whether or not you're going to have. We all need to look at life that way, that every day, every opportunity to see another circuit of the sun, to get up and move around, to breathe God's air, to praise Him, it's a gift. We need to appreciate today. And so that's the theme that I have tonight, is appreciate today. I was talking to some preacher friends the other day, and it kind of spurred this thought for me for tonight. We were talking about how much all of us have taken for granted prior to 2020. You know, that prefaces it with prior to 2020. But if we've learned anything yet from this year, it ought to be that, right? If you want to take one lesson away from 2020, it ought to be this: don't take anything for granted. Whether you're talking, our health, our family, our physical means, especially our lives, our very lives, we can't take anything for granted these days. Because today, each day, should be looked at as a gift. Because it may be all we have. It makes me think of the expression used a number of years ago, party like it's 1999. Now, it makes me sort of sad that there's some within the sound of my voice tonight that don't have a clue what that means, probably. But for those of us who lived in those days, we understand there was a very real uncertainty at the end of the year 1999. Leading up to, we were wondering what was going to happen when the clock struck midnight on January 1st, 2000. We're so dependent on our technology. We have been even before 99, but would our machines just quit? we wondered what would happen. It sounds silly now because nothing really of consequence happened, as it turned out, but it was a big source of anxiety then. So now it's something different. 5 years from now, or probably less, it'll be something else again that we'll be anxious about besides a virus. Each day is a gift. Appreciate it, not bemoaning what you didn't do in the days before or being overly concerned about what you plan to do tomorrow or other tomorrows that may not ever come. Just use this day to the full. Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount, when talking about how God provides so well for us in ways that we just as often take for granted, urged us to live in day-tight compartments. That is, as he said it in Matthew 6:34, each day has enough trouble of its own. Why do you want to borrow any more? Don't borrow some from the past. It's already gone. Don't try and buy any from the future. Appreciate today. Be sure in your prayers that you're asking God for your daily bread. That's what he taught us early in chapter 6 in that model prayer. That was significant because he didn't want us to focus too far backward or too much in the future. When you do, you forget who provides every day. One day at a time. That's how our lives ought to be lived, one day at a time. And so I'll let Paul basically have a last word. I've done that often lately, the Apostle Paul. To the Ephesian Christians, he said, "Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil." That's Ephesians 5:15 and 16. I usually get around to speaking in some format or another every year on the subject of time and our best use of time. So this is kind of it, at least one of these times for this year, as we get towards the end. Let's start by doing it with an appreciation and use to the full of today. God bless.
Time is filled with swift transition. Not a moment who can stand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Hold to God's unchanging hand. Hold to his hand, to God's unchanging hand. Hold to his hand, to God's unchanging hand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Hold to God's unchanging hand. Trust in him who will not leave you, whatsoever years may bring. If by earthly friends forsaken, still more closely to him cling. Hold to his hand, to God's unchanging hand. Hold to his hand, to God's unchanging hand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Hold to God's unchanging hand.
Please join me in prayer. Our most gracious and loving Heavenly Father, we do thank you for this day that you have given us, and each and every day, and the blessings that you give us. We thank you for the message from your word tonight that reminds us that you give us each and every day. We ask that you would be with us each day that you give us. Please help us to spread your word and be a light to those around us. We thank you for all the blessings that you have given this family of yours here in Salado. And we ask that you would continue to be with us, be with our elders as they guide this congregation, Be with the ministers as they help us to better understand your word, and the teachers as they bring us lessons to help us each and every time that we gather. Please be with those of us who are not with us, with the family tonight. Be with them that they can return to better health and as soon as possible, understanding the situation that your whole world is in now, that they can be back as part of this family as we meet. We thank you for all the blessings that you've given this nation, and we ask that you would continue to be with us and be with our leaders, that they will understand that this is your world and they just have a part in taking care of it as we do. Please be with us each and every day that you give us. Guide us, guard us, and help us to live as your Son did, an example for us. And it's his name we pray. Amen.
All right, good evening again. Forgot to turn that. I'm filling in for a bass singer tonight, so I forgot to turn one mic off as I was using another one. But anyway, it's all right. Before we begin the class, and we are in Daniel chapter 2, if you would be joining us in the text tonight, Daniel chapter 2. It is it falls almost equally into two parts tonight, so we're going to look at part 1 this evening. Try to get through 1 through 23. That ends in a section of praise to God. Before I do that, let me mention several things. Normally do not like to make announcements at this time, but I want to mention the men's breakfast that's at Gaines and Mary Smith's place this Saturday morning at 8:30. I'm going to send out an email tonight, and that's going to have maps attached for you men to see the way. So I hope we can have a good turnout for that. It's going to be outdoors. All the precautions he sent me today, all the precautions that folks are taking with serving anything to anyone, that they'll be taken. So I hope that you'll make a point to join us and let Charles Varenkamp know, or the Smiths, if you're planning to come. I know it would be good to have a count. This Saturday and Sunday afternoons. Well, Saturday in the morning, 9 to 5, and then Sunday, noon to 4, the trains are returning, the 10-plate trackers. I noticed there was a good write-up in the paper today from Tim in the Village Voice. They're returning to our activity center. So if you're big into that, or if you don't know what that's about, never experienced that before, then come look at the display they're going to have this Saturday, beginning from 9 going to 5 p.m., Sunday from noon to 4 p.m. I think it's a scale-down setup, but I know it'll still be good. It'll be something neat to see. And then be praying about Sunday. That is a special day, and that is our version here at Salado Church of Christ of $1 Million Sunday. And that's the day we set aside every year for giving to Eastern European Missions. If you're not familiar with them, they are a ministry of Churches of Christ that help put Bibles in places around the world, specifically countries in Eastern Europe, well, really all over Europe, in Russia and Ukraine, in places where they have not had the Bible readily available. And so we have made that a long time ago, a ministry that we've been involved in. And this Sunday, our area's representative, he covers a big area. He's based in Abilene, but Monty Tuttle will be here to talk about the ministry, and we'll have an opportunity to give that day. I'm going to have an email also about that, because there's also opportunity to give online, but I have to explain that. I'll do that through an email as well. So be praying about what you would like to give if you're able to do that. It is a great ministry. Okay, chapter 2 of Daniel. Up till now, I want to ask you to think back in where we've been over the territory of the intro, and particularly the first chapter. What are some of the wins, as I'm using the word, for God and for God's team that we have seen in Daniel's story so far? Can you name some of those? Of course, God's team, I'm calling the 4 young men here, Daniel, and I also sometimes call them Daniel and company, Daniel and the three friends. There's 4 that I wrote down from last week. So if you want to count them up. You remember what those were? Starts right off the bat in chapter 1. I'll give you a hint on this first one. God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to besiege Jerusalem. He may have thought he did this on his own, but this was God's plan. God allowed him to do this. This was predicted. If Judah kept on their path, same as Israel had, there were going to be consequences. There was going to be punishment for sin. And so it came through the invasion of the Babylonians, and the not only the invasion, but the deporting of exiles to Babylon. And we understand that not just, they're more than just the 4 young men we're focused on in Daniel's story. A lot more of them went into exile, certainly. But they're telling the story for us of how God was blessing His people, the remnant, even through a time of exile. What else? What other wins were there? What else did God do? Okay, we hadn't quite got there yet. I'm just talking about chapter 1. You're right. You're right. We're going to get there. We're going to get there. That one's chapter 3. But chapter 1, here's a second one. He caused the official to be kindly disposed, you remember, to Daniel and company. What did he give them? Besides the kindly disposition of the one who was put in their, whose care they were put in, good health, what else? Okay, yeah, there's a third one. Knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, right? The Akkadian language we talked about, which would have been Akkadian literature, which would have been all these alternative stories to the creation and the flood and all this, that, and the other, which would have had the effect on ordinary, any ordinary men who weren't as faithful to God, as loyal to God as these were. It would have had the effect of what? What would it have done? In fact, what was it fully intended to do? Yeah, indoctrinate them, but erode their faith, right, in the one true living God. Fully have them embrace in every way worship and loyalty in every way to their current place. So to have just a wholesale change in their hearts and minds and lives. And obviously it didn't do that. And then the fourth win here is God's men were found to be 10 times better. Remember, that might be a literature, thing of exaggeration, but 10 times better than the native wise men. Now, we're given to know why. I think I have this here. Is it because they were so learned now in the Babylonian way of wisdom after 3 years in Babylonian university? Is that? Okay, because God gave it to them. That's the reason. That's the reason. It wasn't because of diet. James, you mentioned that a minute ago about he kept them healthy. It wasn't because of the diet. He not only kept them healthy, but he kept them, remember we said he kept them looking like wise men of that culture would look. Not necessarily what we'd think is great looking, but for that culture, they were looking great. Okay, so it wasn't the diet, it wasn't the language studies, wasn't anything else except faith in the Lord and their agreement, decision already to stay loyal to Him, though outside their homeland. The words, remember, are keyed off on those verse. Let me find it here. Daniel resolved, verse 8. But Daniel resolved. That's the key to the whole thing, really, of chapter 1. Daniel, and presumably that means the other three, had this resolve beforehand, before they got to the crisis time. This is what they were going to do. They're going to stay loyal to God, the one God, God of Israel. McGuigan had this, Jim McGuigan has this note that I liked. I meant to mention it last time on chapter 1, verse 10. He said, one man, he's talking about the steward who was over them when they proposed this experiment. One man feared Lord Nebuchadnezzar, while the other men feared Nebuchadnezzar's Lord. Think about that. That's kind of catchy, isn't it? But it's a true statement. They knew who truly was Lord, as James mentioned in his prayer a few moments ago. Okay, chapter 2 is going to make readers, especially original Jewish readers of this, think very much of Old Testament wisdom. Because what we're already set up by in the introduction in chapter 1 is an introduction of the contrast between Babylonian wisdom and God's wisdom. And of course, you could insert any pagan nation there. I said Babylonian wisdom, but you can insert anything as opposed to God's wisdom. And we're going to notice in their appeal to God for their answers rather than to wisdom that the four young men illustrate the type of wisdom that's displayed in the Proverbs. Okay. Here's some examples of this. Proverbs 1:7. What's the beginning of wisdom? Where does it start? It starts with the fear of the Lord, right? Not in that context, not necessarily a dread, although that's not always bad, but talk about a reverence, a reverential awe and respect for God, for who God is. Another one, and this shows that Old Testament wisdom literature was unified in what it was talking about. Job's conclusion in Job 28, verse 28. One of the times he came to a conclusion says this: the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And then the preacher's conclusion, the preacher of Ecclesiastes, says in the end of all his arguments, remember in chapter 12, verse 13, as he ends up, he says the conclusion of the matter is this. When everything else has been heard, here's the point. Fear God and keep His commandments. That's the whole of man. That's what it's all about for us, is to fear God, keep His commandments. So these show the perfect unity of the devotional wisdom literature, and really how Daniel, in some respects, could very much fit in with that group of scriptures, as well as the prophets. He's in the prophets because of all the future telling that happens in the book through the dreams and visions and so forth. The other thing to remember at the outset. These are tales, court tales, part 1 and part 2, if you will, of the same tale. Tales of contest between God and the regional gods, in this case of Babylon. Now, I put this in the form of a question, I think. As we move from chapter 1 to 2, do we see this contest become more explicit, or is it implicit? Is it kind of under the surface, or is it becoming more obvious in this chapter? What do you think? Hopefully you read chapter 2, at least the first part of chapter 2, before tonight, and refamiliarize yourself with what's going on there. It's more explicit, isn't it? Yeah. It's more out in the open, the contest. The contest from chapter 1, it's a little bit muted, it's implied, but we don't read in chapter 1 about any other detainees or exiles. We just read of what's going on with the 4 young men and their training, but we know there were others that were going through the same indoctrination process, the same training process that those 4 underwent. And you see the result of the contest. Again, it was a win for God that these 4 were the valedictorians of all the group of new folks who went through this 3 years of training. God's men came out on top. So that's one of those wins for the God of Israel over these regional gods of Babylon. Okay, now we have it more explicit in chapter 2. Because in one corner you have Daniel and company, and the other corner you have, in fact, they kind of take center stage, and Daniel and friends kind of come in late in the game, don't they? In this story. But you have in the other corner all the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers of Babylon. So let's look at the first part of this, beginning in verse 1. In the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he couldn't sleep. I like McGuigan's little, he has these little jabs, all through his narrative and his little commentary. And he says, if God did this with dreams, think what he would do with use of armies, right? Nebuchadnezzar was upset and unsettled and disturbed just because of a dream that he had. God moves in many, many different ways. Okay, so the king summoned magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers. Now, in the Hebrew, that word is Chaldeans. Now, these people were, the Babylonians were Chaldeans. That's a regional name, but that also became kind of a specialized word used from the Hebrew for astrologers, okay? By the way, who would have been, where would the guys have fit? I thought this was a kind of interesting question since we're getting closer to that season. Where would the Magi have fit in this? The wise men that came from the east to see the Christ child. I agree. I think they would have fit in the astrologer category. And guess what? Here's what's kind of neat. They would have likely come from very close to this part of the world, right? At least some of them would. But so that was still a thing in go all the way down in time to Jesus' day. This was still a big deal. This belief in practice, it's still a big deal today. practice of astrology and sorcery and witchcraft and all of this. Why was this so strictly forbidden in the law of Moses, under God's law? Why was this strictly forbidden in Israel? You have an answer, one of you? Okay, well, yeah, that's enough reason, isn't it? God said so. You're right. You're right. Okay, it's going around God, right? To evil, in trying to manipulate and trying to pretend you can figure out the future without consulting God. Saul got in big trouble for it. That's right. And guess what? The witch, I always say in quotes, conjured up Samuel, but did she really? No. God brought Samuel up, or Samuel came on his own up to appear before Saul. The witch didn't do anything. We're going to see that here in a minute, okay? So stay tuned with that. All right. He says to them, all these kind of runs the gamut of everyone that comes under category of wise men. I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. Well, he's really saying, I want to know what the dream was. Now, do you think he really forgot? Are you just testing his guys here, maybe? You think he is? Just a test? If it was significant enough that he wanted to call them in to see what this is all about, I'm not sure he would have forgotten it. Yeah. So that's what McGuigan suggests. He says he just telling them he forgot. That he probably did not. So anyway, he says, "Tell me what it is." The astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, and here we start this back and forth. They're going to say, "Oops, I didn't mean for that to." Now you're going to see each successive slide. I think you're going to see the whole thing. I didn't mean for that to happen, but they're going to say at least a couple of times, "So what's the dream? Don't leave us in the dark. Our job is interpreting dreams, not telling dreams. So what is it?" So since you have it up there, did astrologers have a dream content 101 in Babylonian U? I don't think so. I don't think so. Their books, their commentaries were all about interpreting, reading into what dreams meant. They didn't know. They didn't have any supernatural powers any more than Nebuchadnezzar did to be able to conjure up what he actually dreamed. That would require getting inside his head somehow and to get the content out. They couldn't. They said that's above their pay grade, right? We can't do that. Also notice here that the king he's aware, and we'll get to this in a minute, that they might very well pull something over on him, right? They might just make something up. So that's another thing I think is a test. If you can tell me what it is, then you can certainly interpret it, right? And consequently, conversely, rather, if you can interpret it, it stands to reason you ought to be able to figure out what it is. I think that's Nebuchadnezzar's reasoning. Okay, a little bit skewed, but be that as it may. So he said, "I had a dream." Dreams for Babylonians said something about what was going to happen in the future. Okay, so that's why this was so significant, why he called in everyone in the kingdom that had wisdom background, why he called everyone in on it. Because he wants to know, what does this mean about the future? With us, our dreams usually say something from our past, maybe some recurring fear. If nothing else, it's that we shouldn't have eaten something that we ate the night before, right? So, not that big a deal usually, but dreams were a big deal for folks in this culture. Okay. Here's an ongoing problem, or a big problem here that occurs. One of the main jobs of wise men, especially astrologers, was interpretation of the dream, not the telling what the dream was. So let me read a little further here. Here's another thing to note. From 2 verse 4, we've mentioned this in the introduction, but from 2 verse 4 all the way through the end of chapter 7, we now are going to have Aramaic as the language of Daniel. Okay? So he says, they answered the king in Aramaic, which was their trade language. O king, live forever. Tell your servants a dream and we'll interpret it. This is what I firmly decided. If you do not tell me what the dream was, interpret it, I'll have you cut into pieces. This guy is harsh. And your houses turned into piles of rubble. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you'll receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me. Once more, they said, let the king tell his servants a dream and we'll interpret it. Now he thinks what? He thinks you're just stalling for time. In fact, he basically says that, right? You're trying to get me to change my mind. My mind's already made up what I'm going to do if you don't tell me what the dream is. He says you're trying to gain time. You realize this is what I firmly decided. If you don't tell me, there's one penalty for you. You've conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then tell me the dream, and I'll know you can interpret it for me. Okay. Here we get to the big reveal, which is another big win, or about to be make apparent, another big win for God, the God of Israel. Verse 10. What's the amazing omission that we hear in verse 10?
Yeah. Tell me the dream.
Yeah. No one on earth, so no human being can do what you're asking to be done. They just played their hand, right? Well, but he's not on earth. So no human being can do this, he says. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they don't live among men. That's a big reveal, isn't it? A big admission. So, going back to what I said about the lady that King Saul went into to have Samuel conjured up. These guys are telling us, it's all smoke and mirrors. Telling us, the readers. We really don't have that kind of power. And all they can do as far as interpreting a dream is consult their books. But to do what he's requiring, to tell the dream, it requires a supernatural kind of knowledge that he said we don't have. We can't do it. So this is a huge, huge admission. Think about it. For people that are watching this contest, especially the original readers, what are they saying? These guys thought they had the upper hand, right? These guys thought they're in control. Turns out they're not really in control after all. And that Daniel's message so far is resonating again, that God is in control. And we're going to hear that confession again here in a few moments. They're confessing they've always been over their heads. Okay. So now we have the answer to the question coming up here, but I ended with last Wednesday night. And that is, how did Daniel and company get out of this dilemma? Was it by use of Babylonian wisdom that they'd learned in these 3 years at university? Bingo. Which means there wasn't anything to the wisdom. Any true wisdom comes from above, comes from God, the God of heaven. Okay, not the Babylonian kind. So Daniel and his friends enter the story late in the game, and we see, I think, a little bit more of God's missionary intent. I found it interesting in my studies this week that John Calvin said, do you ever remember reading this? That John Calvin said Daniel's mistake was he should have let all the pagan wise men die, that he should have let them all be killed. That's what John Calvin says was Daniel's mistake. But I see a little bit more of God's missionary intent here, and let the whole world know. Remember, who is God, and He doesn't want anyone to perish, as Peter would say it, 2 Peter 3 verse 9. But everyone come to repentance, everyone to come to acknowledgement that He's God. Sorry. I know. So that really his statement made no sense there to say that he should let her, because he was going to be a victim. Exactly. And so they weren't afraid to die. I'm convinced of that because they faced it several times in this story. But what point would it have served? It would not serve God's mission for them if they just checked out early in the story. So, but it's true that I think his men actually stepped in to save the lives of these pagan wise men, magicians, sorcerers, and all this. What's ironic about that later in the story? I could say they didn't really return the favor, did they? I think they had a short memory, because eventually the table would be turned and they would be seeking to have the lives, because of jealousy and all, seeking to have the lives of Daniel and company. So they were not like-minded with Daniel and his three friends. So Daniel answered in ways, again, reminiscent of Old Testament wisdom, is seen in places like Proverbs 14:29. I'm just going to read a couple of these real quickly. A patient man has great understanding, but a quick-tempered man displays folly. Notice what happened when Arioch had gone out to put to death the wise men. Verse 14, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He knew how to answer him kindly, patiently. 16 verse 32 is another one. Better a patient man than a warrior. I should have remembered that one. A man who controls his temper than one who takes a city. And then 25:15. Though through patience a ruler can be persuaded, and a gentle tongue can break a bone. So he asked the king's officer why they issue such a harsh decree. He explained the matter to Daniel. At this, he went to the king and asked for time so he might interpret the dream for him. Yes, sir. What's your question? Why that Daniel got away with it and they didn't? Right. Maybe so. Yeah, he was not trying to explain it away, not trying to rationalize, I guess. I don't know. That's good. Good question. Yeah, it just depends on how you translate that verse 16. Mine in the NIV says that this Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Now, I wanted us to discuss this real quickly. Some scholars say that the three friends had every right to be upset with Daniel because the order in which he did this. See what I'm saying? He put himself in a difficult spot, saying, "Well, we can do this," and then he proceeds to go and have his three friends pray, and presumably he prays as well. Should he have had it? Should he have turned that around? Should he have prayed first and then said, "Well, now we've got the answer"? In other words, you see what I'm saying? He kind of put God on the spot. He didn't have any traction to ask that of God, but he kind of put, not that you can put God on the spot, but he kind of did, and kind of put the three friends on the spot too. Right. Yeah. And that's probably all it comes down to, is he was just speaking out of faith that I'm going to consider this a done deal, and then I'm going to put feet to my prayers, or prayers to my feet, whatever, however you want to say that, commit to praying about it, because I feel like it's as good as done, even before I ask. Maybe. I don't know. But it's bold, right? It's bold to say, well, I can do it, and then go and pray to God for the ability to do it. Because he knew good and well he didn't have it within himself to do it, right? He had no leg to stand on. You know, if those guys who'd been in the business for years, and Daniel's a teenager, remember? If these guys who'd been in the business for years said, we don't have any leg to stand on, then Daniel sure didn't. Daniel didn't. So, I just think that's kind of interesting, kind of an opinion thing, I guess. What's first, the chicken or the egg? What kind of deal? But anyway, all right. I think that's all I have on leading up to that. But so they do the one thing we know that their only recourse to do. They don't appeal to Babylonian wisdom. They pray. They simply pray. And during the night, verse 19, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. And Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, "Praise be the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are His." Notice, not anyone else's. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, God of my fathers. You've given me wisdom and power. You've made known to me what we asked of you. You've made known to us the dream of the king. Wonderful prayer that this concludes with. Now, what's interesting is you'll see, and mention this in all that introduction for several weeks, that for the most part now, from this point forward, when you see exclamations of God, praise to God, it's mostly going to be from the pagans, those you wouldn't expect, who display honor and praise to God and extol Him and His greatness. So any other thoughts or comments or questions here in the first half of this chapter? Right, yeah, the king, yeah. Right. Well, sure, yeah. Mhm. Right. Mhm. Right. Right. Could be. Could be. They went back and did the only thing they could do. Like you say, they knew there was nothing to the other way, the Babylonians' way. So their only recourse was to the God of heaven. So yeah, exactly. Anything else? All right. Your assignment then is verses 24 through 49. We're going to get the first part of something that's going to be expanded on in the later chapters of Daniel, especially 7 and forward from there. So so study up on the dream, what the dream was, and the interpretation of it, and we will get into all of that, Lord willing, next time. Thank y'all.